Jacques Callot is going to be known for his etchings. In fact, he almost entirely works in etching and engraving. And in terms of subject matter, he's going to look at the thing that's happening around him all the time, that most artists are trying desperately to ignore. He's going to create the Miseries of War series, where he's looking at these constant wars between Catholics and Protestants that are brewing throughout Europe at the time. And he's going to be one of the first artists to show us the gory details of battle. For example, we're going to see the hanging of various enemies. We're going to see the sacking of cities, the burning of churches, things that everyone knows happens, but we never really talk about. In modern terms, we might see video on YouTube of an Apache helicopter firing a missile into a large dark rectangle that we're told is a building full of people. But we don't have artists on the ground depicting those people in their last moments or depicting their death, which is exactly what he's doing here. And from that Miseries of War series, I want to call your attention to Hanging Tree. This is a particularly dark image, but let me remind you, this is not happening in the United States. All of the ideas of lynching, etc., do not exist here because this is happening in France and on the European continent. Very different context. We will see lynchings in art later on, just not at this point. So what you're seeing here is enemy soldiers being hung from a tree. Priests trying to give absolution, while soldiers try and basically throw lots. They're basically throwing dice to see who gets, well, the dead man's stuff. And there's nothing that's going to give us a sense of reconciliation. There's nothing comforting here, and that's intentional. He again wants to remind us of the horrors of war. So, for example, what we will see, I need to bring up my pen, is the executioner bringing another victim up, putting the noose around his neck, while a priest beneath him is trying to give him some sense of absolution, holding up the cross. Beneath, we have another captive getting absolution, kneeling before the priest. Two different ways of going to one's death. Accepting it here, possibly being dragged to it here. And of course, everyone reacts differently when it comes to times of death. Here on the drumhead, we see soldiers throwing lots and trying to determine who gets the dead man's stuff, the clothes, the weapons, the money, etc. Here we see another priest providing absolution and another bound captive. You'll notice the captive is pretty obvious. The clothes are much simpler. They're a little bit ratty. His hair is long. He's not as put together as the soldiers that we see. And what he's trying to do is get across the ideas that Rubens is. Rubens, of course, reminding us in Consequences of War of how horrible total war really is. The artist here is doing the same thing, although he's indicating that all of these soldiers are part of the killing. Even if they're standing aside, these soldiers who have their banners, their pikes in perfect order, they seem to be in parade formation, all watching, simply spectators unwilling to stand up for the people being hung. Now, Callot's Miseries of War etchings are among the first realistic pictorial records of the human tragedy of armed conflict. And while he's doing the same thing that Rubens is doing, the difference is Rubens is using metaphor. The god Mars and depictions of music as a broken lute, for example. Whereas Callot is putting it in very human terms. This is a scene that you could well see if you were alive at the time. This idea of executing the enemy, decimating their forces, sometimes killing every fifth, every 10th, or maybe every member of that group, whoever that happens to be. And of course, you can imagine the soldiers sitting there going, well, they're terrorists, they're freedom fighters, they're Protestants, whatever the situation might be, and feeling like they are doing the right thing. Whereas these men in the tree, of course, see themselves as martyrs, being killed for whatever belief led them to war in the first place. Ultimately, what Callot gives us is, in very realistic terms, the idea that no one wins in war. These people are guilty and arguably will end up in hell, or worse, I suppose, if there's a worse. And these men who are willing to give their lives for something they believed in will die anyway. No one walks away a winner in Callot's Miseries of War.